Hello again. This is probably part two to an idiot's guide to King James only, and to idiot guides to Textus Receptus only. And one of the things why I've done these two series is because a lot of times the critical texts misrepresent the Textus Receptus King James only and also the majority text in the Byzantine text type. So Textus Receptus only, I'm just going to just deal with that term really. It's a term only used with the Textus Receptus or King James, but let's look reason why people use the term only because they believe that their Greek text is the best. So the Nessus Aland, the critical text, is based best on the best and oldest manuscripts. So the oldest manuscripts is equated with the best. Robson Pierpoint believes it's the best manuscript because it's the best representative of the Byzantine tradition. Family 35, because it's been carefully written by scribes. Very little need for textual criticism because the similarity with all the manuscripts and very little singular readings. And also with Wilbur Pickering believes that God has preserved his word in Family 35. Hodgins Farstad it's the best on because it's based on the majority of manuscripts. And the Textus Receptus believes the best because it is preserving God's word and underpins the mainstream translation for King James and NKJV. Just to add a point here is that mainstream translation of the Byzantine text type history is it's the Textus Receptus. That's the only mainstream representative of the Byzantine text type that's been translated in English and other languages. So Daniel B. Wallace, I'll start him again, yeah? He said the King James is rightly called the single greatest monument to the English language, but it's more than a literary and a translation standpoint. This is because the Greek manuscripts behind the KJV text is far inferior to that of modern translation in terms of textual basis. Late manuscript states are less than a perfect process of creation. Now, one of the things that's always said, some thrown at the Textus Receptus, is that the Textus Receptus Erasmus, always point to Erasmus. They never talk about Stephanus, they never talk about Beza, Eliza, or even Scrivener to a certain extent. They always talk about Erasmus' first edition. And they said he only used 8 manuscripts, right? So one of the things Daniel B. Wallace had said is that he only used 8 manuscripts, but they never talk about Stephanus, about the maturing Textus Receptus. And I'm going to touch some of those things again. And also in terms of when he used the term inferior, I'm going to deal with that point there. So let's talk about Erasmus. He used only a few manuscripts. Now, any person who's read about Erasmus, he was a man who traveled over Europe, Italy, Switzerland, England. He traveled over Europe to find the best manuscripts. And basically, looking at all these different manuscripts, he worked from a small number. But I'm going to explain is that even though he spent over 2 years in front of a handful of manuscripts, was his first edition, his knowledge regarding the Greek New Testament did not come solely from these few manuscripts in a 2-year period. So he traveled all over. If you read his annotations, anything about the life of Erasmus, he looked at more than just 8 manuscripts. Okay. So let's look at Stephanus. Now, Stephanus is a very interesting Textus Receptus because number one, it's the first one to have chapters and verses, and it's also the first one to produce a critical edition. So he did 4 editions, and he does references to the Complutensian polyglot. Interesting, the Complutensian polyglot is that he actually had the best manuscript at the time, really commissioned by the Catholic Church, and 15 additional manuscripts. Now, one thing that Daniel B. Wallace said, oh, we have the manuscripts that they underpin the Textus Receptus, which is not necessarily the case. It's not necessarily the case because, which I'll go into further, because also, I'll explain why. So in terms of Stephanus, in his preface, right, he announced his ambition of producing a text superior to Erasmus. And that's why if you look at modern texts, because they always point to Erasmus, and they're very famous, but they never talk about Stephanus, and they never talk about Beza, probably more influential, right? So it's based on, and the reason why he was quite ambitious is because it was based on his access to the Royal Library. So he was the printer for the French king at the time. So here's the thing about the argument about having so few manuscripts. So this was a paper done by An Ting Yi, critical apparatus for Stephanus. And in the notes, it said, although no records have been found, a historical event might shed some light on this issue. And this is regarding Codex Regianus, Codex L. In 1538, a policy was issued by the King of France, King Francis of France, to search for and acquire Greek manuscripts abroad. At that time, they were extremely scarce in his royal collections. The policy obligated French ambassadors to collect as many manuscripts with Greek characters as they could. As a consequence, some 500 Greek manuscripts were brought to the Royal Library between 1540 and 1550. It could be the case that Codex Regius was one of those treasures, all right? So think about it, there's 500 manuscripts. Now, interesting fact for Dan B, or Uncle Dan, is that the thing about is with the Byzantine manuscripts, they're quite homogeneous. So, for example, I'll use example with Family 35. There's about 200, 250 of those manuscripts. If you take 5 of them, because they're so alike, they'll be representative of about 200 manuscripts. So even if you use Erasmus' patterns of the manuscripts, because they were taken out for the Byzantine tradition, they're representative of a larger group of manuscripts. They represent 80 to 90% of Greek manuscripts. Now, one of the things what Dan B. Wally says is that we have available more manuscripts than those compilers of the Textus Receptus. That isn't true, Dan, and Dan should know better. So, the Textus Receptus is based on the Byzantine text, which represents 9% of manuscripts. When the number of agreements with the manuscript text is high, is also a relatively high number of manuscripts, showing an agreement ratio of more than 90%. So the representatives of this text type are extremely homogeneous, exhibiting a high ratio of agreement amongst themselves. So you see the point here. Even if you took 5 or 10, because the agreement of them, they represent a wider group, much more than the critical text. This is from Kurt and Barbara Land. For manuscripts with the fewest majority readings, that is of the early manuscript, exactly the opposite is true. Even the most closely related among them generally show agreement ratio of between 60 and 70%. Hermann Hosker wrote in his book, Codex Being Its Allies, there's 3,036 differences in the Gospels alone. Between Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. And I was going to do a video about the disparity. One of the things that the Oregon said and Eusebius about how there was such a disparity. Everyone's copying their own manuscripts. And therefore, the argument could be, were they rogue manuscripts? So one of the things Daniel B. Wallace said, we know what those manuscripts are. No, you don't. Why? Because the cataloging system. So what Stephanus uses an Arabic one, right? So the proper cataloging, as we know it today, we can recognize manuscripts, really start with the 18th century with Johann Jakob Wittstow. He established a groundbreaking system that's still the base for modern cataloging, assigning letters for uncials, capital letters, and numbers for minuscules. They still use it today. Constantine van Tischendorf, 19th to 20th century, the Gregory numbering system, then Hermann von Soden, and Kurt and Barbara Land, right? But the point we got here is that they didn't have a numbering system during the time of the Textus Receptus. Therefore, you cannot truly know what manuscripts they used. You can only try and guess and surmise, but you can't truly know what manuscripts were used. Yeah. Because the numbering system for manuscripts, as we know it, so we know all the manuscripts for Family 35, we know all the manuscripts for Robson Pierpont, we know all the manuscripts for Hodgkin and Foster, we know all manuscripts for the critical text, right? Tyndall House, SBL, but we don't fully know the manuscripts that were used for the Textus Receptus. One, because there wasn't a recognized numbering system or grouping system at the time. So a lot of it's surmising what was used. Yeah. All right. So we also have to take into account in terms of history. After the translation work on the King James Bible was finished, the majority of the translation notes were stored in the London Guildhall. Although much of stone-built Guildhall survived, the library did not. In the Great Fire of London, it's one thing, being in England, we learned at school about the Great Fire of London, how devastating it was to London at the time, and also the houses being made of wood, etc. That the Guildhall library was consumed by fire. The historical records of the London Fire Brigade still bear witness to the fire in the Guildhall. There exists today scant evidence of the preparation notes of the King James translators. The only records still in existence are those which are held outside of the old London City Roman wall. Some historical evidence still exists in the Bodleian Library at Oxford University. It's only a fraction of the workings. So a lot of stuff was, and also you have to take into account is that we've had First and Second World Wars. It was actually said that Hermann Hoskier, he collated quite a number of manuscripts for the Book of Revelation. Uh, and what happened was he actually would do facsimiles of them, and they actually some of them, those manuscripts, original manuscripts, were destroyed. There was some of the Hermann Hoskier's facsimile of them which survived. Yeah, so in terms of a lot of manuscripts were destroyed. We don't know how many these people had access to, but we know that a lot of manuscripts were destroyed, especially in the world wars. Right. So one of the things I said, do we have the manuscript that the TR used? Now, here's the interesting thing here. Um, this is got this is related to John 19, verse 28. Now, I want you to look at line 10, the column 10. I want you to look at column 10. Now, if you look at the bottom, it's the TR, King James TR, ST Stephanus, and RP's Robson Pierpoint. And you look at 10, the variant there, the only variant that links in is with Codex Sinaiticus. Now, we know the Textus Receptus did not have access to Codex Sinaiticus, which is discovered about 200-300 years afterwards. But what we find is the reading was preserved in the manuscripts that they used. All right, so the manuscript that the compilers of the Textus Receptus use preserved the reading found in Codex Sinaiticus. And as I said, you could look at there on column 10, you see the variant Ede, yeah, and the only one who has that exact format is O1, which is Codex Sinaiticus. I'll put it down here. So I've looked at it as a breakdown. So if you look at John 19, verse 28, if you break it down, the first part is supported by Codex Sinaiticus, Y, N corrector, I think it's lambda and 157. But the second part of that verse is by Sinaiticus, Codex Sinaiticus only. So you find with that particular verse, only Sinaiticus gives us the whole verse. All right. Okay, so age of manuscripts versus the age of reading. Now, one of the things that Dan Wallace constantly makes an error about, late manuscripts does not mean late readings. So we've got Hebrews 6, verse 3, which is supported by Family 35, Papyri 46, 3rd century, Codex Aleph, Codex B, which equates to 40% of manuscripts. And one of the things that Dan Wallace keeps on saying is that old manuscripts means late old readings, but early manuscripts go right back to the 2nd century. So when you take up your Nessus Zolan, these based on manuscripts goes back to the 2nd and 3rd century. The same could be said for the readings of Codex of Textus Receptus. And also, I may add a lot of Byzantine uh, printed texts like Family 35, Robson Pierpoint, and uh, Hodges and Farstad. But where you get this from is that you will notice a lot of papyri readings agree with the Textus Receptus that even though the manuscripts were 11th to 12th century, they had readings or variants which go right back to the 2nd and 3rd century. Age of manuscript versus age of reading. Here's an interesting one. It's a very interesting one. I have to say, it's James Snap, when I was reading some of his works. Brilliant, brilliant guy. I never met him, but brilliant guy. He pointed this one out in one of his presentations. Now, the word Oti. So, First Peter 5, verse 8. The interesting with this one, this variant is very interesting because it's not found in Hodges and Farstad. It's not found in Robson Pierpoint, and it's not found in Nestle Zealand. But it's interesting with this variant. It's found in P72, right? And Family 35 and 50% of Greek manuscripts. Yeah. So that's a very interesting one. So if you look before P72 was found, they would say, well, where did this reading come from? Yeah. So you see, Textus Receptus has readings which go right back to the 2nd and 3rd century. Matthew 26, verse 52. He said, put up again thy sword into its place, Well, that takes all shall perish with the sword. This is a reading which goes against the uh, Family 35, Robertson, Pierpoint, and Hodgson Faster. It goes against the moderate text. So this is a particular reading, perish, um, uh, and it's supported by Codex B, P37, Codex Aleph, and Codex L, and Codex D. All right, so you can see here that the compilers of texts, they had access to Sinaiticus in terms of certain readings. Erasmus did have that, and Stephanus had access to Codex L, and Beza had access to Codex D. Wolfgang put a nice little graph. This is taken from Harry Sturt's book, and these ones TI variants, right? As you can see, that I think amounts to 168 variants. 106 variants supported by early papyri, 2nd and 3rd century. So when you hear people like Dan Wally saying, well, you know, old manuscripts equals old readings and early manuscripts equal readings, and Edith Guide to Textus only, you should understand that a late manuscript can preserve a very early reading. And you see here, the most was in the book of John, 67 papyri variants in the book of John. So it's 100, about 168, I think it is. So those are all the readings TR supported by early papyri. This is strictly what you find into TR. Now here's the thing, one thing said inferior manuscripts. So this is now Maurice Robertson wrote a paper and he identified 105 variants with verses with zero manuscript support. Now, one of the things I like to be fair-minded is that I personally believe that 1 John 5 verse 7 is scripture. Now, I could understand if your Byzantine priority, Family 35, Hodges and Fires, that you argue against that because from where you're coming from, you're going in terms of where you're coming from. But a critical text person cannot argue against 1 John 5 verse 7. Reason being, at least there's manuscripts that have 1 John 5 7. A lot of people nobody's ever argued against Maurice Robertson's paper because of the way the Nessus land has been developed. You have 105, at least 105. I think it's quite a conservative figure. At least 105 verses with no manuscript support. At least 105. I believe it's more. You've got 22 in the book of Revelation. You've got 18 in the book of Luke. All right. So verses with zero manuscript support, and it gets worse as you go along. As you go through more verses, you end up with whole pages with zero manuscript support. So I can understand if somebody wants to argue 1 John 5 verse 7. If you're from the Byzantine priority, Family 35, and Hodges and Farstad. But if you're from the critical text, it's a bit hypocritical to argue about late and very few manuscript 1 John 5 7 when you have 105 verses with no manuscript support. And I could also add 2 Peter 3:10, and which I've said in my previous video, that how can you move from a variant, which is the word found, with few manuscript support to a verse with no manuscript support? That doesn't make sense. So that's that there. So let's some example of numbers, yeah. So let's look at some of the facts, yeah. Critical text, unstable text, consequent translations constantly need to be updated, yeah. It constantly needs to be updated. So if you have like an NIV, you're going to have to update it because you're going to have an NA828 coming out next year, and United Bible Society 6 coming out next year. So a lot of the translations, that's why they have to keep them being revised to keep up with the number of revisions for the Greek New Testament. The text is a stable text. So if you look at the King James, New King James, it's a stable text. It's not changing, yeah? They don't have to keep doing a first edition, second edition of except probably if the language changes, but there's no need for the textual basis to change because it's a stable text. The critical text introduces error. See Matthew 1, verse 7 and 10, with the names of the king. That is an error. interesting thing is that if you look at Codex Vaticanus, you see two different spellings of one of the kings, yeah, Ammon, right? Um, so and Amos, yeah. So you see there real error there in Codex Vaticanus. So the argument for them is that the scribe made that no, not the scribe made the error. They're saying the apostle made the error. It was crazy. Textus Receptus doctrine is sound, and also add that for the Byzantine, uh, Robson Pierpoint, Hodges Farstad, Family Third, this stable doctrine is sound. Yeah. Compilers do not aspire to produce a text that represents God's word. What their argument now, before if you look at Weapon Hort, they believe they were producing the autographs, early textual critics, but these ones now, they say that it presents a window into the changing manuscript. Yeah. So they believe that the text represents God's word. Critical canons have no empirical evidence, i.e., the shorter reading. So what you find, Griesbach, he introduced about the shorter reading, harder reading, all these kind of reading canons, but there was no empirical evidence to prove. So we notice it's only in 1968 with E.C. Cowell, with his basis of single reading, so identify scribal habits. Every study in scribal habits shown that scribes were more prone to omit than add. All right. Um, Critical text canons, i.e., rule number 9, produce manuscripts with zero manuscript sports. And one of the things that Daniel B. Wallace said, he said that the creation of it was poor. Well, I put that back to Daniel B. Wallace. Can somebody please answer Maurice Robinson paper about zero manuscript support? Yeah, for these verses. Uh, so the text now, Textus Receptus, was confirmed by early manuscripts. Now, the critical text, it was not used by the church, only came to existence in 1881. The Textus Receptus, coming from the Byzantine tradition, was used by the early church fathers. And what you will notice is that there was more references to the Byzantine tradition by the fathers than the Alexandria critical text. But it was a text, the Byzantine tradition was used by the early church fathers in their preaching, their teaching, and the lectionaries, etc. Right, the early uh, uh, manuscripts in the papyri, they had numerous scribal errors. Codex Sinaiticus is the most corrected manuscript, with Codex Ephraim, I think, as well. So the most corrected manuscript. Papyri had numerous singular readings. A lot of them were poorly written. If you look at James Roy's Study to Scribal Habits, they're very poorly written. I put down last one, use rogue manuscripts, which, like the witnesses against Jesus, could not agree with each other. The Byzantine tradition was homogeneous. There was a general agreement. So this is why, even if you are Byzantine priority or Robson Pierpoint, you allude to that, normally when it comes to translation, you'd have to go to the um, King James or the New King James. You'd have to come back to the Textus Receptus, because in terms of mainstream translation, it's only the Textus Receptus, which is representative of the Byzantine tradition, which has a mainstream translation, which is the King James and New King James. Now, I know people are arguing against the New King James. I haven't studied that part, and it's not something I'm really being led to go down. But if you are from that, and I was listening to a talk by Maurice Robinson, and someone asked about translation. And if you're talking about a mainstream translation, you really have to go to the New King James or King James, which is underpinned by the Textus Receptus. Right. So I would say to Daniel B. Wallace, I think I need to do more research to see if these things be so. So he's already started to study already. Yeah. He's already looking up his books, and hopefully he'll give me a nice response. But if he doesn't understand anything, if he doesn't understand anything, I'd give him somebody else to refer to, which is this man. You get stuck, speak to this man, Dr. Jeff Riddle. All right. Pastor Jeff Riddle. All right. So God bless you. God keep you. May cause fire. Hope you enjoyed that. And feel free to make comments and like and all those things. Nice.